If you have just settled beneath your quilt, and the lamp at your bedside is turned low, and the small fire upon your hearth has begun to whisper its slow, gray lullaby, then come closer to the fender, dear listener, and let the candle gutter as it pleases. The night is large, and the world is quiet, and we have a long, gentle tale before us. It begins, as so many of our stories do, in an English country house upon a bright, cold morning, when the rooks were calling above the elms and the frost still lay in white seams along the lawn. Listen, then, and we shall walk together into March of the year 1814, and into the breakfast room at Whitlock Hall in Warwickshire. The breakfast room faced east, and at this hour the long windows held a thin, stretched sunlight that lay upon the polished floor in pale lozenges. The fire had been lit early. Its warmth was modest but kindly, and the silver coffee pot upon the sideboard breathed a slow ribbon of steam toward the molded ceiling. There was a smell of fresh bread, of orange marmalade, of wood smoke, and the faint, dry lavender that Miss Argent insisted upon laying in every cupboard of the house. The sideboard bore eggs in a covered dish, kidneys, a cold ham, a basket of toast, and a small pot of honey gathered from the hives at the home farm the previous September. Whitlock Hall, though no longer rich, still maintained the small civilities that had been beloved of its late master. At the head of the table sat Lady Beatrix Whitlock, the present mistress of the house, a handsome woman of 47, whose dark hair had been arranged that morning with great care, and who wore a plum-colored morning gown trimmed with gray braid. Her countenance, when in repose, had a sort of carven grandeur. In animation, it grew sharp. To her right sat her own daughter, Miss Honoria Whitlock, 21, whose coloring was much like her mother's, though in her the dark eyes were more restless and the chin more inclined to the petulant. To Lady Beatrix's left, seated quietly with her hands folded a moment in her lap before she lifted her cup, was Lady Cordelia Whitlock Pendragon, the daughter of the late Earl of Pendragon by his first marriage, 23 years of age, fair-haired, fair-skinned, with grave gray eyes and a soft, considered manner that some mistook for timidity, and which was, in truth, only the courtesy of one who had known long quiet. Cordelia had taken her place at the table a little after the others, for she had been delayed at the foot of the stairs, where her right knee, which was always stiffer in a frost, had asked her to wait a moment before going on. She had waited. She had laid one gloveless hand upon the carved newel post, and counted 3 slow breaths, and then she had walked into the breakfast room with that almost imperceptible unevenness in her step, which had belonged to her now for 12 winters. None of the servants had remarked it. They had long since ceased to remark it. Mr. Banbridge, the butler, had only inclined his white head a fraction more deeply than was strictly required, as he did each morning, and drawn back her chair. "There is news, my dears," said Lady Beatrix presently, setting down her letter and tapping its edge against the cloth. "We are invited, all of us, to the spring ball at Wynnsford Park. 3 weeks hence, on the evening of the 15th. The Dowager Duchess herself has written. It is to be a great occasion, for the new Duke is in residence, returned at last from his command at sea, and his mother is determined that he shall meet the county." "The new Duke," repeated Honoria, with a small bright pause that made the words mean rather more than they ought. "Lord Rhys trade scant Wycherley, the 9th of his line. They say he is 32 and has dark eyes, and they say he was decorated under Lord Nelson, and they say he is grave and reads. Mamma, do they say he is rich?" "He is the Duke of Wynnsford, child," answered her mother, with a faint, indulgent smile. "I should not trouble myself upon that head." Cordelia poured a careful little stream of cream into her coffee, and listened to the porcelain ring softly under the silver. She had heard of his grace, of course, as everyone in Warwickshire had. The elder brother had died of a fever taken in Italy 2 years before, and the younger had been brought home from his ship to put on his black armband and his coronet at once. She had pictured him only vaguely, as one pictures any figure whose name is spoken often, and whose face one has not seen. A tall shape in a dark coat, perhaps, looking out upon the sea. She had not pictured herself in any room with him. She turned the cream jug a little upon its tray and waited for her stepmother to go on. "You shall both be presented," said Lady Beatrix, smoothing the letter with the flat of her palm. "Honoria's gown is already in hand. Madame Lefebvre comes tomorrow with the silks. Cordelia—" She paused, and the pause was not unkind, only practical, like the pause of a careful housekeeper before the linen press. "Cordelia, you may also have a new gown, of course, but—" Honoria did not let her mother finish. She set down her toast, and her dark eyes lifted with a sweetness that everyone in that room knew the shape of. "Dearest Cordy," she said, "I have been thinking, and I do hope you will not mind my speaking. The corridors at Wynnsford are said to be exceedingly long, and the floor of the great saloon is parquet, which is so very hard upon the feet, and the supper is taken at 1 in the morning, you know, which is dreadfully late for one who tires. I wonder if perhaps you should remain home this once, quietly, with Miss Argent. There would be no shame in it. I should send for the music from the ball if you wished, and tell you everything." There was a silence then, of the kind that rooms make when something delicate has been laid upon a stone shelf. The fire whispered. The little clock upon the mantel struck the half-hour with a small, decent chime. Lady Beatrix lifted her coffee and lowered it again without drinking. She did not contradict her daughter. She did not, however, second her either. She watched Cordelia as one watches a vase upon a high mantel during a draught. Cordelia did not lift her eyes at once. She set down her cup. She regarded the small steam that rose from it. When at last she spoke, it was in that voice her father had taught her, low and clear and even, which had outlasted him. "Thank you, Honoria," she said. "It is kindly meant, I am sure. But I shall come to the ball. Papa wished us to know our neighbors, and the Dowager Duchess was at his funeral and stood in the rain with us at the Lich Gate. I should like to thank her for that, if I may, in person." Honoria smiled with her mouth and not her eyes. "Of course, dear," she said. "Only do not say I did not warn you when your knee aches at 3 in the morning." "I shall not," said Cordelia. Mr. Banbridge, who had been adjusting an entirely satisfactory chafing dish upon the sideboard, permitted himself the very smallest tightening of his shoulders, which only Cordelia, who had known him since she could walk, observed. He had, after all, carried her up the stairs in his arms when she was 11 years old, and had laid her with the delicacy of a chamberlain, placing a relic upon her own pillow. He had not forgotten it. He never would. After breakfast, Cordelia took her shawl from the hall and went out by the side door into the kitchen garden, where the espaliered pears stood bare upon the warm south wall, and the first crocuses had pushed up beneath the box hedge in startled little points of yellow and lilac. She walked the length of the gravel path, slowly, evenly, and she did not look back at the windows of the house. She heard in her mind Honoria's voice, and beneath it, quite clearly, her late father's voice, which had been a kind voice and a steady one, saying, as he had often said, "My dear child, do not let any room make you smaller than the Lord made you." The wind came down off the long ridge above Whitlock and stirred the bare boughs. A robin sang once, hopefully, from the trellis. Cordelia stood at the end of the path and laid her gloved hand upon the cold sundial, and thought of Wynnsford Park, and of 3 weeks, and of a corridor she had never seen. To understand a girl, the old saying runs, you must understand the day that first made her quiet. Cordelia had been a noisy child once. She had been the despair of nursemaids and the delight of stable boys, and she had ridden, at 11, a small dappled pony called Pippin, with the casual fearlessness of a creature who had never been thrown. Her father, the Earl of Pendragon, had watched her go over her first low hedge with the indulgent pride of a man who did not believe in stifling a girl's spirits, and had laughed aloud when she came back, breathless and triumphant, and demanded a higher fence. It was in the September of her 11th year that the accident came. The day had begun, as such days do, with no warning at all. The hedges along the home meadow were full of late blackberries. The sky was the soft, bright blue of an English autumn. The pony's coat was glossy from the brushing he had been given that morning. Cordelia had ridden out with a groom and her father across the lower pasture, and they had cantered down the long flat between the elms, and she had been laughing into the wind. They came to a little ditch, scarcely deeper than a plowed furrow, but at the lip of it, Pippin had set his small hooves and shied. A hare, perhaps, had broken from the grass before him, or the light upon the water had startled him. She had felt the world tilt with a sudden white clarity, and then she had felt nothing very much for what she was afterward told had been a long quarter of an hour. She remembered, in fragments, her father's face, very close to hers, saying her name as if he were laying it down upon a clean cloth. She remembered the groom running, and a gate flung open, and the sky moving above her in a slow, uncomplaining wheel. She remembered Mr. Banbridge's hands, very large and steady, lifting her from the gig at the front steps, as if she weighed no more than a folded shawl. She remembered Miss Argent, who had been then her governess, bending over her in the candlelight with eyes that did not weep until later, and a voice that did not tremble until much later still. The right leg, the country surgeon said, had been broken in 2 places below the knee. The setting was done in her own bedroom, with her father holding her hand and Mr. Banbridge holding the candle, and she did not scream, because she was her father's daughter, but she bit through her lip, and the small white scar upon it never quite faded. The recovery was slow. It was a recovery measured in seasons, not weeks. For a long time she lay upon the daybed by the schoolroom window, and Miss Argent read to her from Mrs. Radcliffe and from Cowper, and from the Latin primer, and at length from Horace, and her father came each evening when his work upon the estate was done, and sat beside her, and told her of the lambs, and of the hedger Tom Wenlock, and of the new colt who had a star upon his forehead. When at last she stood again, her right leg was a little shorter than her left. The surgeon said it could not be helped. Bones, he said, are honest things, and they remembered. She walked at first with a stick, then with her hand upon Miss Argent's arm, then alone. She walked across the schoolroom and across the long gallery, and at last down the great staircase, very slowly, while her father watched her from the foot with his hands clasped behind his back, and tears upon his cheeks that he made no attempt to wipe away. "There is my brave girl," he said when she reached him. "There is my brave girl. Now let us go and look at the colt." She had limped from that day to this. The limp was small. Many guests in the house did not at first observe it. She had learned early to take long evenings in pieces, to find a chair before she needed it, to refuse a second dance with a smile that did not betray the cause. She had also learned, with that same slow patience, to be still. She read a great deal. She knew her Horace and her Virgil and a good portion of her Cicero. She could play upon the pianoforte, though she did not love to. She preferred to sing, sitting, when others were already at the keys. She liked roses and the early hours of the morning, and the company of those who did not require her to be anything other than what she was. Her father had died 3 years before our story opens, of a chill taken upon a wet shooting day in October, which had become, within the fortnight, a fever from which he did not rise. He had held her hand at the end with the same calm strength with which he had held it on the day they set her leg. "Be kind to your stepmother, Cordy," he had said, "for she is afraid, and people who are afraid sometimes do unkind things. And take care of Honoria, for she has not had a father long enough." Cordelia had promised. Promises made in such hours do not loosen with time. Lady Beatrix had been her father's second wife, and his marriage to her had been, Cordelia believed, a marriage of comfort rather than of fire. Beatrix had brought a small fortune with her, and an 8-year-old daughter, and a great determination that the daughter should be advantageously placed in the world. Honoria had grown up at Whitlock as a younger sister, and Cordelia had loved her, and tried to teach her her letters, and tied her sashes, and in time had seated, without remark, the brightest dresses, the prettiest dancing master, the center of every drawing room. It had not seemed to her, when she was younger, a sacrifice. It had seemed only a courtesy. Now, at 23, she sometimes wondered, when she was alone in her own room with her hand upon her sore knee, whether she had ceded a little too much. She thought of all this on the gravel path that March morning, with the crocuses at her feet and the rooks above her in the elms. Then she went back into the house and up to the schoolroom, where Miss Argent was sitting at the long table with her account book and her spectacles, and she said very simply, "Tabby, I am to go to the Wynnsford ball." Miss Argent looked up. Her eyes, behind the spectacles, were a soft, intelligent blue, and they were full at once of a careful, watchful warmth. "Are you, my dear? Then we shall make sure you go beautifully." Madame Lefebvre arrived from Warwick 3 days later, in a small pony trap drawn up at the side door, with 3 apprentices and 4 covered baskets, and a portfolio of patterns under her arm. She was a little Frenchwoman of indeterminate age, who had fled Paris in '93 with nothing but her needles and her pride, and who had built up, in the years since, a quiet kingdom among the country families of the Midlands. She measured with a brisk, respectful efficiency, kept her opinions to herself in front of mistresses, and gave them generously to her own apprentices in the corridor afterwards, and had a particular fondness for Cordelia, whose figure she described privately as comme une statue sage, like a wise statue. You understand? The morning room was given over to the fitting. The carpet was rolled back to the wainscot. A long looking-glass was carried in from the hall. The baskets were unpacked, and silks of 6 colors unrolled across the chairs in shining rivers. Honoria was fitted first, by her mother's instruction, and stood upon the little stool in her shift while Madame Lefebvre walked round her with a measure between her teeth. The chosen silk was a peach the color of a sunset cloud, lavishly trimmed with seed pearls along the bodice and the hem, and a deeper coral ribbon at the high waist. To Cordelia's eye, who had been brought up to think modesty itself a kind of beauty, the gown was a touch over-decorated. But Honoria turned before the looking-glass with shining eyes, and Lady Beatrix laid her hand upon her daughter's shoulder with a satisfaction that was almost tender, and Cordelia held her tongue. When her own turn came, Cordelia stepped onto the stool and stood quietly while Madame Lefebvre turned her this way and that. "Mademoiselle, the rose," said the Frenchwoman at length, in her low voice, and she drew from the 3rd basket a length of pale rose silk, the color of the inside of a shell, and laid it across Cordelia's shoulder and stepped back. Lady Beatrix, on the sofa, did not say anything. Her mouth was a little tight, Honoria by the window said brightly, "Oh, that is sweet, dear. Like a child's gown for confirmation. Like a lady's gown for an evening of music, I think," said Madame Lefebvre, in a voice so smooth and so polite that one had almost to be French oneself to hear the reproof in it. Mademoiselle has the figure for simplicity. We shall trim with a little blonde lace, here at the bodice, and perhaps a single white rose at the shoulder, and that shall be all. Madame, you agree?" Lady Beatrix gave the smallest possible inclination of her head. "As you think best, madame. Cordelia, you must of course wear what suits." The fitting was done. The silks were rolled away, and the apprentices carried out their baskets. Madame Lefebvre kissed Cordelia upon both cheeks at the side door in the French manner, and murmured low in her ear, "You will be lovely, my child. Hold up your head." And then she was gone, away down the drive in her pony trap, with the bare lime trees arching above her. The cream silk slippers, made by the same hand a few days afterwards, came tied with narrow ribbons of the same pale rose, and were lined with the softest kid. Cordelia tried them on one evening before the schoolroom fire, and Miss Argent watched her cross the room in them and said, "There, my dear, there. They might have been made for the floor of a king's palace." "They were made for a duke's, Tabby," said Cordelia, smiling. "We shall see if they hold." The 15th of March came at length, after a day of small showers and a clearing toward evening, with the sky beyond the long ridge turning to a tender lilac, and the first stars setting themselves out above the wood. The Whitlock carriage was brought round at 7. Mr. Banbridge himself handed the ladies in. He laid the rug across Cordelia's knees with particular care, and tucked it under her instep, and said very quietly, in a voice meant only for her, "I shall sit up, my lady, however late it goes." "Thank you, Cuthbert," said Cordelia, and laid her gloved hand a moment upon his. He bowed and shut the door. The road from Whitlock to Wynnsford ran across 4 miles of low country, past 2-acre wood and the old pack-horse bridge and the long avenue of beeches that was the beginning of the Duke's land. As they turned in at the great gates, the carriage joined a slow procession of others. Lamps glimmered ahead of them in the dusk, and the sound of the gravel beneath the wheels became suddenly the sound of many wheels, and somewhere ahead, across the lawn, an orchestra was tuning up. Wynnsford Park rose before them, long and pale in the gathering dark, with light burning in every window of its principal floor. It had been built in the 7th Duke's time by a pupil of Robert Adam, and it carried itself with the quiet authority of its century. A great central block, 2 long wings, a colonnade across the front whose columns were that night wreathed each in a slender garland of ivy and white wax candles. Inside the door, the receiving line was already long. Footmen in dark green livery were taking cloaks. A hum of voices, the soft, formal voices of people who knew themselves to be observed, rose from the stairs and the inner hall. The corridor that led to the ballroom was lined with candles set into wall sconces, and the candles were so many, and their flames so steady, that the corridor itself seemed to be made not of stone, but of a long, warm gold. Cordelia walked beside Miss Argent, who had come as her companion. Her stepmother and Honoria were a step ahead. She felt the ache begin in her right knee at the 3rd doorway, and chose to ignore it. At the head of the receiving line stood the Dowager Duchess of Wynnsford. She was a tall woman of 64, in a gown of dove-gray silk, with white hair dressed simply beneath a small lace cap, and a string of pearls about her throat that had once belonged to the 7th Duchess, her grandmother. Her countenance, though lined, was uncommonly fine. She had the long Wycherley nose and the quiet Wycherley eyes, and a mouth that could be very firm, and was, with those she loved, very soft. She had stood in the rain 3 years before, at the lich gate of the parish church at Whitlock, with her hand upon Cordelia's shoulder, while the Earl of Pendragon's coffin was carried past them. She greeted Lady Beatrix with the practiced civility of one duchess receiving the wife of a deceased earl. She greeted Honoria with the same and a little more, and then her eyes found Cordelia, and the carved gravity of her face softened all at once into something altogether warmer. "My dear Lady Cordelia," she said, and she took Cordelia's hand in both her own and held it. "I had so hoped you would come. Your father is much in my mind tonight. He would have stood very straight in this corridor." "Madam," said Cordelia, who found that she could not, for a moment, say anything else, and the Dowager Duchess pressed her hand once and let her pass on with a very small, unmistakable nod toward the room beyond, as if to say, "You are welcome here." Lady Beatrix, behind her, observed this exchange and said nothing, but her mouth had drawn into a thin line, and she was rather more abrupt than usual to the gentleman who relieved her of her cloak. The ballroom was a long, high-ceilinged saloon at the center of the south front, paneled in pale green and white, with a great chandelier hanging from a molded ceiling and 3 pairs of glass doors thrown open along the southern wall onto a flagged terrace beyond. The orchestra was at the far end on a small dais behind a screen of white camellias in pots. The floor between had been polished until it shone like still water. Already a number of couples were at the head of the room, taking their places for the first set. Already, along the walls, the chaperones had begun their quiet survey of the field. Cordelia took a chair at Miss Argent's side and let her shoulders down very slightly and watched the first set begin. She danced the second by previous arrangement with her father's elderly cousin, Sir Marmaduke Pendragon, who had ridden over from his small estate at Avonbury for the occasion, and who did her, in his gentle, shuffling way, the kindest courtesy he knew. He was 71, and his knees were not what they had been. He made no allusion to her own. They moved through the figures slowly together, with the quiet pleasure of 2 creatures who had loved the same man and remembered him. And at the end, he led her back to her chair and bowed over her hand and said, "Your father would have danced this with you tonight, Cordy. I have only stood in for him. Forgive me." "There is nothing to forgive, cousin," she said, and she meant it. But when she sat down, the ache in her right knee had become a sharper thing, and she laid her gloved hand a moment upon her skirt, above the place where the bone had once broken, and breathed, and was still. It was perhaps a half-hour later, between the 3rd and the 4th dances, that the matter of the terrace happened. The terrace lay along the southern front of the saloon, behind the 3 pairs of open glass doors. The night had grown mild enough that several groups had drifted out for air. The candles in the iron sconces along the balustrade made small, bright moons against the dark of the lawn. Honoria, in her peach silk and her seed pearls, had attached herself to a knot of 4 young ladies of the neighborhood, daughters of the Beverleys and the Carstairs and the Greys, and was conducting, in the center of them, that particular kind of conversation in which a young woman who is feeling herself observed becomes a little louder than she ought. Just within the open doors, a few feet from the terrace and quite hidden from it by the tall white camellias in their pots, 3 gentlemen had paused in conversation. They had only that moment come into the room from the smaller saloon, and they had stopped because the elder of the 2 younger men had been describing to the third a particular maneuver off the coast of Cadiz. The third, who stood with his back half to the terrace and his head a little bent in attention, was the master of the house. He was tall, dark-haired, dark-eyed, dressed in the deep blue of his late command rather than the black silk that the rest of the gentlemen wore, with the small star of an order at his breast and a face that, in repose, had the quietness of a man who had spent a great many nights on a quarter-deck under stars. He was Lord Rhys Tradescant Wycherley, the 9th Duke of Wynnsford, and he was listening, in courtesy, to his old Lieutenant Hawksworth tell a story he had himself lived through. He heard, therefore, with great clearness, the voice that came from the terrace. "Oh, but my dear Maria," said Honoria's voice, gay and a little high. "Of course she came. I told her she ought not. The corridors, the floor, the supper at one. It is too much for her. You know it is. But she would come. She is determined to be seen, poor lamb. Though what she imagines will come of it." Here she gave a small, light laugh, the kind of laugh that is meant to be carried. "Well, he is a duke, after all. He will never love a Limp. Not for all the Pendragon name. One must be sensible about these things." There was a small silence on the terrace. One of the Beverley girls said, uncertainly, "Honoria," and then did not finish. Within the room, by the camellias, Lieutenant Hawksworth had broken off in mid-sentence. He did not, at first, dare look at his commander. The third gentleman, Captain Arden, who knew the Duke a little less well, looked frankly at the floor. His Grace of Wynnsford did not move at once. He stood with his head still a little bent, as a man stands who has heard the bell of a clock at an unexpected hour and is waiting to be sure he has counted right. Then he lifted his eyes, and the eyes, which had been quiet, were no longer entirely quiet. "Hawksworth," he said softly. "The dance after the next, I believe, is the supper dance." "Yes, sir," said Hawksworth. "Be so good as to step aside." Hawksworth stepped aside. The Duke did not glance toward the terrace as he passed the camellias. He had no need. He walked into the long ballroom with a steady, unhurried tread, and people, observing him come, made way before him as people will. The Dowager Duchess, his mother, who was standing with old Lady Carstairs near the orchestra, saw him cross the room and laid her fingers very lightly upon her companion's wrist, and said, "I think, my dear, we shall be still a moment." Cordelia, by her chair, did not at first see him approach. She had bent her head to say something quietly to Miss Argent about a glass of lemonade. It was Miss Argent who saw him. She sat up a very little straighter and laid her hand upon Cordelia's and said, in a voice hardly above a breath, "My dear." Cordelia lifted her eyes. The Duke of Wynnsford was perhaps 3 paces off, and he was looking at her and at no one else in the room. She had time for the smallest startled thought. He is taller than I had imagined, and his eyes are kinder. And then he was before her, and he had bowed, and he was speaking. "Lady Cordelia," he said. His voice was low, and it carried as the voices of men used to speaking on quarterdecks carry. It was meant only for her, and yet anyone who chose to listen could hear it. "Forgive my approaching you without an introduction. My mother shall make me one in a moment. But I observed as I crossed the room that the ribbon of your slipper has come loose, and I feared you might trip upon it. May I?" She looked down. It was true. The narrow rose-colored ribbon of her right slipper had worked itself free in the dance with Sir Marmaduke, and lay in a soft loop upon the parquet beside her foot. "Your Grace," she began, and her voice was steady, though her heart beat once very hard against her stays. "There is no need. Of footmen, there is every need," he said very gently, "and no footman in the world shall do it. By your leave." He did not wait for her leave longer than the half-second of her small, assenting nod. He went down upon one knee before her chair, in his blue coat, in the middle of the long, bright ballroom, with the chandelier above him and 100 eyes upon him. And he took the loose ribbon between his fingers, and he tied it. He tied it carefully, as if he were tying any other small civility, the cord of a glove, the sash of a child. He did not look up at her as he tied it, and he did not look up at the room. He drew the bow firm but not tight, and tucked the ends neatly beneath, so that they would not work loose again. Then he rose from his knee in one smooth movement and bowed. "There," he said, as quietly as before. "Now, Lady Cordelia, if you will permit me, the supper dance is in 2 sets' time. May I have the honor?" For a moment she did not speak. She was conscious of the great quiet that had come over the nearest part of the room, of Honoria, frozen in the doorway of the terrace with her seed pearls catching the candlelight and her cheeks gone the color of her gown, of her stepmother by the far wall, her mouth a small stunned circle, of the Dowager Duchess at the orchestra, her fingers still upon old Lady Carstairs' wrist, watching her son with a look of such grave, contained love that Cordelia, glancing once toward her, almost lost her countenance. She did not lose it. She drew breath. "Your Grace," she said, "you do me too much honor. I should be very glad." "Then I am the gladder," he said, and bowed once more and stepped back. And the orchestra, which had paused upon a long-held chord while the country dance was set in order, began the next figure, and the room, with that small hesitation a great room makes before it remembers itself, began once again to move. Miss Argent let out, very slowly, the breath she had been holding. "Well," she said, in the smallest voice imaginable. "Well, my dear, well." The supper dance, as all the world knows, is not the longest dance of the evening, but it is the most particular. For at its close, the gentleman leads his partner through to the supper room and seats her at his side. And during the half-hour that follows, they may converse with a freedom permitted at no other moment of the night. It was a slow set of 3, and when His Grace of Wynnsford led Cordelia out, the ballroom, which had been pretending for the last quarter of an hour not to be watching, abandoned the pretense altogether and watched. He danced, as he did everything else, with an unfussy economy of motion. He took her hand at the proper moment and released it at the proper moment. He did not glance at her foot. He matched, without ever appearing to do so, the smallest hesitation in her step. Once, as they crossed in the figure, he turned a fraction more slowly than the music required, and she felt the kindness of it before her mind had named it. It was the kindness of one who had been at sea long enough to know that a deck shifts and that a good officer shifts with it. When the figure brought them down the long line and out into the corridor and at length into the supper room beyond, he placed her upon a seat near the windows, where the air was cooler, and brought her a glass of cold negus and seated himself beside her. The supper room was less crowded than the ballroom. Small tables, white cloths, candles, the soft clatter of porcelain. A footman set down a plate of lobster patties and another of small almond cakes, and withdrew. "You are not eating, Lady Cordelia," he said after a moment. "I shall, Your Grace." "My given name is Reese," he said, "and we are a long way from the deck. Shall we, for 10 minutes, pretend you do not know my title and I do not know yours? It would rest me." She lifted her eyes to his then, and saw, behind the gravity, the smallest hint of a smile. "Then I shall be Cordelia," she said, "for 10 minutes. "Cordelia," he repeated, as if trying the shape of it. "From Lear, the good daughter. My father loved Shakespeare. He named me before he had had time to consider whether I could carry it. You carry it." She did not know how to answer this, so she said, "You read Latin, I think? My governess says one can tell by the way a man stands at the orchestra." "I read Horace at school," he said. "Poorly. I read him again at sea, between the watches, rather better. There is something about a long voyage that makes one ready for Horace. He is very good upon small things. A jug of wine, a fig tree, a friend's letter. I came to value those. At sea. Equam memento rebus in arduis, she said, almost without meaning to. Servar mentem. He looked at her for a long moment. Remember in difficulty, he said, to keep an even mind. Yes, you have read him then. I had a great deal of time to read, when I was 11. He understood her at once. She saw him understand her. He did not press it, and he did not look toward her foot. He said instead, My elder brother taught me my first Latin. He was 11 years older than I. He died of a fever in Italy 2 summers ago, and that is how I come to be sitting here in this coat. I had thought to be a captain at 40, and a private gentleman by 60. I had not thought to be a duke at 30. We none of us, perhaps, sit in the chairs we had imagined. No, she said, we do not. There was a silence then, but it was not an uneasy silence. It was the silence of two people who had begun to recognize one another and were content to let the recognition deepen. After a moment, he asked her, with the same quiet courtesy, of her father, and she told him briefly of the Earl of Pendragon, and of the wet shooting day in October, and of the Lich Gate. He told her, in turn, of the Battle of the Nile, where, at 15, he had carried a powder bag for his first commander, and of the long blockade off Toulon, and of the day in 11 when the news of his brother's fever had come aboard at Gibraltar. And so I came home, he said. And here is my mother's house, and here are my mother's tenants, and here, I find, are my mother's neighbors, among whom, I have been told this evening, is a young woman who reads Horace and wears rose silk and would have been left at home if her sister could have managed it. I do not believe I had quite understood, until I came into this corridor tonight, what I had come home for. I believe I am beginning to. She set down her glass very carefully. The candle on the table between them dipped and steadied. Your Grace? Reese? She said. Yes, Cordelia. You should know, she said, with the quiet evenness her father had taught her, that I have walked a little unevenly since I was 11 years old. It is not a thing that goes away. Long evenings hurt me. Cold weather hurts me. I am not a great walker, though I love a garden. If you are sitting beside me at this supper, because of what was said upon the terrace, I should rather know it now than later. He did not flinch. He looked at her steadily. I am sitting beside you, he said, because of what was said upon the terrace, in the sense that, had it not been said, I should perhaps not have crossed the room as quickly as I did. I had marked you already, as I came in, when you were speaking with the white-haired old gentleman who danced with you. I had asked my mother who you were. She had told me. She had also told me that she stood with your father at the Lich Gate, and I knew then what kind of family you came from. The matter of the slipper was an opportunity, Cordelia, and I confess it, but it was not the cause. I do not kneel for opportunities. I kneel for people. She looked away, because if she had not looked away, she should have wept, and one does not weep at a duke's supper table over a plate of lobster patties. Eat your supper, Cordelia, he said very gently. We shall walk slowly back. The drive home in the carriage was a long one, though the road was the same 4 miles. Lady Beatrix sat in the corner, with her cloak drawn close about her, and her face turned toward the window, although it was so dark beyond the glass that there was nothing to see. Honoria sat opposite her mother, very upright, her hands folded in her lap, her seed pearls catching now and then the small light of the carriage lamp. She did not speak. She had not spoken since she had come in from the terrace and seen the Duke rising from his knee. Cordelia sat beside Miss Argent, with the rug across both their laps, and watched the dark hedges move past. It was Lady Beatrix who first broke the silence, and her voice, when it came, was a voice that had been rehearsed in a corner of her mind for the last hour and a half. "Well," she said evenly. "Well, that was a most singular evening. I cannot remember when I have seen a duke so forget himself. To kneel, in a public room, before a young lady to whom he had not even been introduced. The Dowager Duchess must have been mortified." "The Dowager Duchess was not mortified, stepmamma," said Cordelia quietly. She smiled. "She is 64, my dear, and she is fond of a pretty story. By tomorrow noon, you may depend upon it, the whole county will be laughing. They will call him chivalrous, perhaps, to his face. And they will say, behind his fan, that the new duke has lost his head over a—" Lady Beatrix paused, and chose her word with the small care of a woman who understands that the wrong word in a closed carriage is a permanent thing. "Over a fragile girl who would have done better to stay at home." Honoria made a small sound that might have been a sigh and might have been a sob. It was difficult, in the dark, to tell. Miss Argent's hand, beneath the rug, found Cordelia's hand and held it, and was perfectly steady. "Stepmamma," said Cordelia, after a pause that had its own quietness, "I should like, if you do not mind, to take supper in my room tomorrow." Lady Beatrix turned her head at that, sharply, in the dim. "Cordelia?" "It is not anger, stepmamma. I am not angry. I am tired. My knee is very sore, and I should like a tray, and Tabby, and the fire. That is all I ask. Tomorrow evening I shall come down again as usual." There was a long pause. The carriage wheels turned upon the gravel as they passed in at the Whitlock gate, and the lamps of the lodge moved across the inside of the carriage in two slow, yellow squares. Lady Beatrix at last drew her cloak a little tighter about her, and said, with a stiffness that was not entirely unkind, "Of course, my dear, of course. Banbridge shall send up your tray." Honoria did not look at her, and did not look at Cordelia. She looked at her own gloved hands, and at the small, loose pearl at the hem of her gown, where her own slipper had caught it earlier in the evening. When they reached the front steps, Mr. Banbridge was at the door, as he had said he would be. He handed the ladies down with his usual care. He gave Cordelia his arm up the steps, and she took it, gratefully, and did not pretend that she did not need it. In the front hall, while her stepmother was giving her cloak to the maid, Mr. Banbridge said to Cordelia, very low, "Lady Cordelia, may I take the liberty, my lady?" "Yes, Cuthbert." "It was a great pleasure, my lady, to know that he knelt." His old eyes were full of tears that he made no attempt to hide and no attempt to spill. "Your father, my lady, would have been—" He could not finish. He bowed very deeply and stepped back. She laid her hand a moment upon his sleeve. "I know, Cuthbert," she said. "I know." She went up the great staircase slowly, with Miss Argent behind her, and the candles in the wall sconces made a long, warm gold of the stair, as the candles at Wynnsford had made a long, warm gold of the corridor. And she thought, as she went, of a man on one knee upon a polished parquet floor. And she thought, with a strange new gentleness, of the words she had not said to him at the supper table, which were simply, "Thank you." The morning came, as mornings do, cool and gray and ordinary. A spring shower had washed the lawn and laid the dust. The rooks had begun their day before the household. By 9, the long windows of the breakfast room were full of a soft, pearl-colored light. Honoria did not come down. Lady Beatrix took her coffee with a face that had been carefully composed over the looking-glass upstairs, and asked no questions of anyone. Cordelia ate a little, and then went up again to her own room, where Miss Argent was sitting at the window with the mending. It was a little before noon that Mr. Banbridge came up the back stairs at a pace not at all in keeping with his usual dignity, and tapped at the schoolroom door. His white head was almost flushed. "My lady," he said. "My lady. Cards." "Cards, Cuthbert?" "His Grace, my lady. The Duke of Wynnsford. He is at the door, in person. He is asking whether the family is at home." Cordelia stood very still for a moment in the middle of the schoolroom. Miss Argent set down the mending. From the floor below, faintly, came the unmistakable sound of Lady Beatrix's voice raised in a brisk whisper, and the running of light feet upon the landing. Honoria, summoned no doubt from her bed. "Cuthbert," said Cordelia, "show his Grace into the morning room, if you please. I shall come down." "Very good, my lady." She went down at her own pace, with her hand upon the rail. Lady Beatrix met her at the foot of the stairs in a state of carefully arranged surprise. "My dear Cordelia, how providential! His Grace is here, of all people. Honoria is just coming. We shall all sit together in the morning room. It would not do for him to be received by only one of us. Honoria, dearest, your shawl, the green? Yes, do come down, child." The morning room was reached. The Duke of Wynnsford was standing by the window in a dark green coat, with his hat in his hand. He bowed to Lady Beatrix with all proper civility. He bowed to Honoria, who came in white-faced and silent in her green shawl with the same. He bowed to Cordelia, and his eyes, as they found hers, were grave, but not unsmiling. He took the chair Lady Beatrix indicated. He drank a small cup of coffee. He spoke for 10 minutes upon the weather, the roads, the new bridge at the bottom of the Wynnsford Lane, and the prospects of the lambing. Then he set down his cup. He turned, with great courtesy, to Lady Beatrix. "Madam," he said, "I have come, in part, upon a small particular errand. The rose garden at Wynnsford was much praised in my late father's time, and I believe Lady Cordelia mentioned, last night, a fondness for roses. I wonder whether she might be permitted to walk in the garden here with me a little, while you and Miss Whitlock take your second cup. The morning, I think, has cleared." Lady Beatrix's hand upon her cup went very still. Honoria, beside her, did not move. There was a brief moment of perfect silence in the morning room, in which one might have heard the old clock upon the landing tick, and the sparrow in the eaves, and the distant rattle of a pail in the kitchen yard. "Of course, your Grace," said Lady Beatrix, with the small smile of a woman who has lost a hand of cards and is determined not to be observed counting her losses. "Cordelia, fetch your shawl, my dear." The rose garden at Whitlock lay to the south of the house, behind the yew hedge, and it was at this season only just beginning its year. The standard rose trees had been pruned down to short black canes. A few early buds, no bigger than peas, were just visible at the joints. The gravel path between the beds was wet from the morning's shower. The Duke offered Cordelia his arm, and she took it, and they walked the length of the garden slowly, twice, before he said anything beyond the smallest civilities. "I have come, also, upon another matter," he said, when they had reached the sundial at the end of the path for the second time. He stopped there and turned a little toward her. "It is not, precisely, a pleasant matter, and I had thought a great deal upon how to bring it before you. Will you allow me to be quite plain?" "Yes, your Grace." "Reese." "Yes, Reese." He drew from the breast of his coat a small folded packet of letters tied with a black ribbon. "I have, in the last fortnight," he said, "received 4 anonymous letters. They came by the post, with no direction beyond my own. They concerned a young lady of the neighborhood. They alleged that she was unstable in her mind, owing to an old injury, that her humors were disordered, that her family feared for her behavior in society, and that any gentleman thinking to address her ought first to consider very carefully whether her infirmity was of the body alone. The young lady, Cordelia, was you. She did not speak. The color did not leave her face. She was too much her father's daughter for that. She looked steadily at the small black canes of the standard roses, and she waited. "I did not believe the letters," he said. "I did not believe them when I read the first. I was sure of it when I read the fourth. They were too anxious to persuade. But I am the Duke of Wynnsford, Cordelia, and there are certain courtesies I owe my house and my mother's peace. I made inquiries. I had a man who is good at such things compare the writing with samples to be obtained by various small civilities in the neighborhood. The hand that wrote these letters is your stepmother's. He said it without pleasure and without heat. He said it as a man who had to lay a difficult thing down upon a clean cloth and was determined to do it gently. I had thought," he continued, "to lay them last night before her at the ball, but I would not embarrass my mother's roof. I shall lay them, with your permission, upon her drawing-room table this afternoon. She shall be offered, in private, a choice. There is a small dower cottage at Colmslie, in Devon, that was my late aunt's. The rent is 100 a year, and the situation is mild. She may retire there, with such of her possessions as she chooses, and live very quietly, and the matter shall go no further than this garden and that table. Or I shall be obliged, and I shall be obliged, to make the matter known, in those proper quarters where the writing of such letters must be answered for. I had rather she chose Devon. I believe she will. May I lay them down?" Cordelia did not answer at once. She thought of her father's last words to her. "Be kind to your stepmother, for she is afraid." And she thought of the years of small slights, and of Honoria upon the terrace, and of the breakfast room, and of the lich gate. She thought, too, of the small pension that had been her stepmother's by her father's settlement, and of the cottage at Colmslie, which she had never seen, but of which she had been told once that it had a south wall good for fruit. "Lay them down, Reese," she said at last, "quietly, and tell her, please, that the south wall at Colmslie is good for peaches. My father said so. Tell her—" She paused and drew a slow breath. "Tell her that I shall write." He inclined his head. "I shall tell her, Cordelia." They walked once more, the length of the garden, in silence. At the sundial at the end of the path, where they had stopped before, he stopped again. He did not let go her arm. Rather, he set his other hand a moment upon hers, where it lay in the crook of his sleeve. "Cordelia," he said. "Reese. I came this morning upon another errand also, the third and last. I had thought to wait, and to be more proper, and to call several times more before I asked it. I find, this morning, I do not wish to wait. Will you marry me?" She did not look up at him at once. She looked at the wet gravel between her slipper and his boot, and she felt, with great clarity, the small ache in her right knee, and the small, steady beating of her heart. "You should know," she said slowly, evenly, lifting her eyes at last to his, "that I will limp on every day of our marriage. It is not a thing that mends. There will be evenings I cannot dance. There will be mornings I cannot rise as early as I should wish. There will be staircases I shall take with my hand upon the rail, and gardens in which I shall ask you to slow your pace. I am 23, and I have considered this, and I tell you so that you may consider it also." He looked down at her with the same grave kindness with which he had looked down upon the loose ribbon of her slipper the night before. "Yes," he said, "and I shall walk slower." She put her hand to her eyes, then only for a moment, because it was not a tear of grief. He did not move. He waited, as he had waited at her chair, with a great patience that was the gift of the long watches at sea. When she lowered her hand, she was smiling. "Then yes, Reese," she said. "Yes, I will." 3 weeks afterward, on a soft April morning when the hedgerows along the Whitlock Lane were full of new green, and the blackthorn was in a foam of white blossom at every turning, and a very small wedding party gathered at the small parish church of St. Mary the Virgin near the gates of Whitlock Hall, a thing happened of which the village remembered the smallest particulars for a great many years. The church was an old one, low and gray and ivy-grown, with a Norman door and a single bell in its short tower. It had been the burial church of the Pendragons since the reign of Henry VII. The morning was cool but bright. The rooks were calling from the elms across the churchyard wall. The clock in the tower struck 10 as the family came down the lane. Within, the church had been quietly dressed. The pews had been polished. White narcissi from the gardens at Wynnsford had been set in 2 great copper jugs upon the altar, and bunches of pale primroses, gathered at dawn from the bank above the home meadow by Mr. Banbridge's grandniece, had been tied to the ends of the pews with white ribbon. The old organ wheezed gently to itself. The Dowager Duchess sat in the front pew on the north side, in a gown of soft dove gray and a small bonnet, with her gloved hands folded upon her lap and her eyes rather bright. Lieutenant Hawksworth, in his best blue, stood at the chancel rail beside the bridegroom. Captain Arden was in the second pew. The Wynnsford tenants who had been able to come stood quietly at the back, scrubbed and beaming. Lady Beatrix was not there. She had gone to Colmsley a fortnight since, with 2 trunks and her own maid, and the small matter of the letters had been laid aside, as the Duke had promised, in silence. Honoria was there. She sat in the second pew, in a plain gown of pale lilac, very pale herself, her hands folded in her lap. She had asked 3 days before, in a very small voice, whether she might come. Cordelia had taken her hand and said, "Of course, Nora. You are my sister." Honoria had wept then, properly, for the first time perhaps in many years. What had passed between them in that hour was not for any other ears, but it had ended in a kind of peace. In the small vestry to the side of the chancel, Miss Tabitha Argent was fastening the last pin of the veil into Cordelia's hair. The veil had been the Dowager Duchess's own, her gift. Old Brussels lace, cobweb fine, worn by a Wycherley bride in the time of George II. It fell over Cordelia's shoulders like quiet water. "There, my dear," said Miss Argent very softly. "There. Now turn for me." Cordelia turned. The small mirror upon the vestry wall showed her a tall, fair young woman in a gown of cream silk, with a single white rose at her shoulder, her gray eyes very clear, her mouth steady. "Tabby," said Cordelia. "My dear." "Thank you. For Horace, and for the daybed by the schoolroom window, and for not weeping where I could see you until much later. Thank you for all of it." Miss Argent's mouth trembled once and was firm again. "Go and be married, my lady," she said. "Your father would have said the same." In the porch of the church, Mr. Cuthbert Banbridge was waiting. He had been given, by Cordelia's particular request, the office of giving her away in the absence of any near male relative. He had not spoken of it without his voice catching since the morning she had asked him. He stood now in his best black, with a small white rose in his lapel, which Miss Argent had set there with her own fingers, and his white hair was very neatly combed, and his hands shook a very little, which he was determined no one should see. When Cordelia came to him from the vestry, he bowed as he had used to bow when she was 11, and the surgeon had only just gone and offered her his arm, and she laid her gloved hand upon it. "Well, Cuthbert?" she said, smiling at him. "Well, my lady," he said, and his voice was nearly steady. "Well, my dear, slowly does it." The organ changed its tune. The small congregation rose. The west door of the church was opened wide, and the April sun fell straight down the aisle to the chancel rail and laid a long path of light upon the worn flagstones. She walked at her own pace, as she had walked all her life, with that small, gentle unevenness in her step that she had carried since she was 11 years old. The limp was not hidden, and it was not hurried. It was simply itself. Mr. Banbridge walked at her side, his arms steady, his eyes wet, his face full of a happiness so quiet and so complete that the Dowager Duchess, watching him, found herself obliged to look once at the narcissi in the copper jug to keep her own composure. At the chancel rail, the Duke of Wynnsford was waiting. He had not turned until that moment to watch her come. He had been told once by some grave aunt of his boyhood that a bridegroom ought not to turn before the music. He turned now. He saw her at the far end of the aisle, in her cream silk and her old lace, walking slowly upon Mr. Banbridge's arm, with the spring sun upon her hair, and the small, uneven music of her step upon the stone, and his dark eyes went very still, in the way they had gone still in the corridor at Wynnsford the night he had heard a voice on a terrace. He did not move to meet her, although every muscle in him wished to. He waited at the chancel rail, as he had waited at the chair, with the great patience of a man who had stood many watches under stars. When she reached him, Mr. Banbridge laid her hand into his with a small bow that was the bow of 50 years of service, and the Duke received it and held it, and inclined his head a fraction toward the old butler, and Mr. Banbridge stepped back to his place in the front pew beside Miss Argent, and sat down and took out his handkerchief with great dignity. The vicar, who had baptized Cordelia 23 years before, opened his book. The service was a simple one. The vows were spoken low and clearly. There is no need to repeat them here. You know the shape of them, dear listener, as well as I. When the Duke set the ring upon her finger, his hand did not tremble, and when she looked up at him, his eyes were grave and full and quiet. The vicar joined their hands and pronounced the old words, and the bell in the short tower rang once, then twice, then 3 times, and the rooks rose from the elms in a slow black wheel against the bright sky. They walked back down the aisle together. They walked at her pace. He had not said so, and she had not asked, and they did not need to. He did not slow to make a point of his slowing. He simply went at her speed, as a deck goes at the speed of the sea beneath it. Mr. Banbridge stood as they passed him and bowed. Miss Argent, beside him, lifted her hand a moment to her mouth and lowered it again, smiling. Honoria, in the second pew, looked up, and Cordelia, passing her, met her eyes and gave her the smallest, most particular nod, which was a thing only sisters understand. Honoria's face changed. She was very young then, suddenly, and very tired, and very glad. In the porch, the village children were waiting with handfuls of primroses. They threw them and laughed, and the petals fell upon the cream silk and the dark blue coat alike. Outside the lych gate, the carriage of Wynnsford stood, with its 4 bays freshly groomed and its harness shining, and beyond it, along the lane, the spring stretched out, and the world was very large and very kind. And there, dear listener, in the bright porch of a small grey church on an April morning in the year 1814, we may leave them. For the rest of their long and quiet life is not quite our business, and you have heard the part of the story that asked to be told. Stay a moment by the fire, however, before you sleep. Let the candle burn another small while. There is a thing I should like to say to you, very softly, before I close the book. We do not always understand, in the rooms we walk, why the floors seem so long. We do not always know who is watching from the doorway with kindness. We are told, sometimes, by voices we love and by voices we do not, that we shall not be loved as we are, that a limp will not be born, that a quietness will not be chosen, that a slow step is a small disqualification from the long figure of the world. It is not true. It has never been true. The good men of this earth, dear listener, and the good women, do not love only what walks evenly. They love what walks honestly. They kneel, when there is need, upon polished floors and upon parquet and upon the cold stone of churches, to tie a loose ribbon, to lift a fallen glove, to take a hand that has waited a long while to be taken. And they rise, and they offer the supper dance, and they walk slower, and that, in the end, is the whole of it. So if you are still listening by the fire, with the lamp low, and the quilt drawn up, and the small gray ash settling in the grate, take this with you into your sleep, that there are knees that bend without thinking in this world for the people who limp, and there are men and women who will walk slower, and there is no evening, however long its corridor, that is holy without candles. Lady Cordelia found her candles. May you find yours. The fire is lower now, and the night is wide. Let the small clock upon your mantel chime as it chooses. Sleep gently, dear listener. Sleep well. The story shall keep by the hearth until you wake, and the candle, when it gutters at last, shall gutter kindly, as all good candles do at the close of a tale. Good night, then. Good night from the fireside at Chapters by Candlelight. Good night, and a long, quiet, tender rest to you, until we meet again by another fire on another evening with another small Regency story to share.